They snickered when he walked across that stage. 78 years old, hands trembling slightly as he reached for his diploma. The younger graduates whispered behind their caps and gowns. Some even pointed. Here was this old man, shuffling, in his worn dress shoes, taking forever to cross what should have been a moment of pride. The ceremony had been going on for hours, and patience was wearing thin. When he stumbled slightly on the steps, a few audible chuckles escaped from the crowd. His granddaughter, sitting in the third row, felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. She wanted to stand up and tell them all to shut up, but she stayed frozen in her seat, watching her grandfather's dignified shoulders straighten despite the mockery. The university president handed him his bachelor's degree with a polite but hurried smile, clearly wanting to move things along. Harold Peterson had waited 60 years for this moment. 60 years since he'd left college in his sophomore year, 20 years old and full of dreams, when his country called. When the letter came in 1952, he didn't hesitate. He packed his textbooks in a box, kissed his sweetheart goodbye, and reported for duty. Korea was a world away, and college seemed like a luxury he could return to later. Later never came. Not when he got back, shell-shocked and different. Not when he needed to work 3 jobs to support his young family. Not when life kept demanding everything he had to give, leaving nothing for the dreams he'd put in that dusty box. But they had no idea who they were laughing at. The scattered applause felt hollow as Harold made his way off the stage, diploma clutched in his weathered hands. He'd earned this degree through night classes, online courses, and sheer determination that had surprised even himself. At 78, when most people were settling into retirement, Harold Peterson was still fighting battles, just different ones now. The mockery stung, but it wasn't unfamiliar. He'd faced worse than a few immature college kids who couldn't understand why an old man would bother with education at his age. They saw frailty where there was strength. They saw foolishness where there was courage. His granddaughter Sarah finally reached him as he descended the steps. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears of pride and anger. She'd watched him study at the kitchen table for years, reading glasses perched on his nose, fingers moving slowly across textbook pages that were harder to see than they used to be. She'd seen him fall asleep over his laptop, still trying to master technology that came naturally to kids a quarter his age. She'd witnessed the determination that got him through statistics and chemistry and literature courses that challenged minds 60 years younger than his. What happened next would silence every single person in that room. The ceremony continued with more traditional graduates, young faces full of hope and possibility. Harold found his seat and tried to ignore the occasional glance thrown his way. Some looked curious now, maybe wondering about his story. Others still seemed amused by the spectacle of an elderly student. He folded his diploma carefully and placed it in the inner pocket of his best suit jacket, right next to something else he'd been carrying for decades. Something that told a story these people couldn't imagine. Sarah leaned over and whispered, "Grandpa, I'm so proud of you. Don't let them get to you." Harold patted her hand with his own weathered one, marked by scars that spoke of a life fully lived. "Honey," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "I've been through worse than a few people not understanding. This degree isn't for them. It's for me, and for your grandmother, and for everyone who believed I could do it." The ceremony was nearly over when the university president returned to the podium with an unexpected announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we conclude today's ceremony, we have a special presentation. We've recently learned that one of our graduates has an extraordinary story that we feel compelled to share with all of you." A murmur went through the crowd. Harold felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he used to get before dangerous missions. His granddaughter looked at him with questioning eyes, but he just stared straight ahead. "If you believe that courage doesn't have an expiration date, that learning never stops, and that every person deserves respect regardless of their age, then you understand why this story matters. Hit that like button, leave a comment saying respect, and subscribe, because some lessons can only be taught by those who've lived them." The president continued, "We'd like to invite Harold Peterson back to the stage, along with Colonel James Mitchell from the local Veterans Affairs office." Harold's heart began to race. He hadn't expected this. The murmuring in the crowd grew louder as people tried to understand what was happening. Sarah squeezed his arm, her eyes wide with anticipation and confusion. Harold stood slowly, his legs suddenly feeling less steady than they had all day. The walk back to the stage felt longer this time, but the atmosphere had shifted. The laughter was gone, replaced by curious silence. Colonel Mitchell was waiting with a small wooden box and a folder thick with official documents. The president gestured for Harold to stand beside him at the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," the president began, his voice carrying a gravity that hadn't been there during the regular ceremony. "Sometimes we have the privilege of recognizing not just academic achievement, but a lifetime of service that deserves our deepest gratitude and respect." Harold's hands were shaking now, but not from age or nervousness, from memory, from the weight of decades carrying something he'd never spoken about, something that had shaped every day of his life since he was 20 years old. The colonel opened the wooden box, revealing a medal that caught the light and seemed to hold the attention of every person in that auditorium. The Bronze Star, the medal Harold had been awarded for valor in combat during the Korean War, a medal he'd never received in an official ceremony, a medal that had been lost in military bureaucracy for 70 years. The crowd was completely silent now. Even the people who had been checking their phones were paying attention. Colonel Mitchell stepped to the microphone. Harold Peterson left college in 1952 to serve his country in Korea. During the Battle of Old Baldy, then Corporal Peterson single-handedly held a position against enemy forces for 6 hours, allowing his unit to evacuate wounded soldiers. His action saved 17 lives that day. Due to the chaos of war and administrative errors, his Bronze Star was never formally presented. It has taken us 7 decades to correct this oversight. The medal in his pocket would change everything. Sarah was crying now, her hand pressed to her mouth in shock. She'd known her grandfather was a veteran, but he'd never talked about the war. Like so many men of his generation, he'd buried those memories deep and focused on building a life, raising a family, and moving forward. The details of his service had been locked away, shared with no one, not even his late wife. But the military doesn't forget its heroes, even when the heroes try to forget themselves. Harold stepped forward to receive the medal that should have been pinned to his chest when he was 21 years old. Instead, he was receiving it at 78, in front of hundreds of people who minutes earlier had been laughing at what they perceived as an old man's foolish quest for education. The weight of the medal was nothing compared to the weight of the memories it represented. Memories of friends who didn't come home. Memories of fear and courage existing in the same moment. Memories of being young and believing you were invincible, then learning you weren't, then finding the strength to keep going anyway. Colonel Mitchell pinned the Bronze Star to Harold's jacket with practiced precision. The click of the clasp was audible in the silent auditorium. The United States Army recognizes Corporal Harold Peterson for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an armed enemy. His extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty reflect the finest traditions of military service and bring great credit upon himself and the United States Army. The standing ovation began slowly. First Sarah, shooting to her feet with tears streaming down her face. Then the faculty on stage. Then row by row the audience rose until every single person in that auditorium was on their feet, applauding a man they'd been mocking just an hour earlier. The sound was thunderous, overwhelming, and it went on for minutes. Harold stood there, medal gleaming on his chest, diploma in his pocket, accepting applause that was 70 years overdue. Every person who laughed would now understand their mistake. Among the graduates, faces that had shown amusement now showed shame. The young man who had snickered the loudest was clapping the hardest, his face red with embarrassment and newfound respect. The girl who had rolled her eyes was wiping away tears. They were learning something that couldn't be taught in any classroom, that wisdom comes in many forms, that courage doesn't advertise itself, and that the people you dismiss might be the very people who made your freedom possible. Harold's mind drifted back to those days in Korea, to the cold that cut through every layer of clothing, to the sound of artillery that never left your ears, to the faces of the boys who'd been beside him in those trenches, boys who'd been 19, 20, 21 years old, carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. Some of them never got the chance to grow old, never got the chance to go back to college, never got the chance to be mocked by people who couldn't understand their sacrifices. The ceremony concluded with a different energy than it had begun. As people filed out, many approached Harold. Some wanted to thank him. Others wanted to apologize. A few wanted to hear more of his story. Sarah stayed close to his side, still processing what she'd learned about her grandfather. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" she whispered. Harold looked at his medal, then at his diploma, then at his granddaughter. "Some stories are too heavy to carry alone and too important to burden others with. But maybe it's time some stories were told." A young graduate, one of the ones who had been particularly vocal in his amusement earlier, approached hesitantly. "Sir, I owe you an apology. I had no idea. I was completely out of line." Harold studied the young man's face, seeing genuine remorse there. "Son," he said kindly, "you didn't know my story, and I didn't expect you to. But maybe this is a lesson about not judging people before you understand them. Everyone you meet is fighting battles you can't see." The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour. Harold found himself talking about things he'd kept silent about for decades, about coming home from war to a country that was trying to forget the conflict had ever happened, about working multiple jobs while struggling with what they now call PTSD, but what was then just called being shell-shocked, about putting dreams on hold for so long that you almost forget you had them, about deciding at 75 that it wasn't too late to finish what he'd started. The Bronze Star ceremony had been unexpected, but Harold realized it was exactly what needed to happen. Not for him, but for everyone in that room who needed to learn that heroism doesn't always look like what you expect. That the elderly man struggling with technology might be the same young man who once held a position against impossible odds. That the person you're laughing at might be the reason you have the freedom to laugh at all. As the auditorium emptied, Harold sat quietly for a moment, his granddaughter beside him. The medal was pinned to his jacket, the diploma was in his pocket, and for the first time in 70 years, both parts of his life felt complete. The education he'd been forced to abandon and the service he'd been called to perform were both finally recognized, both finally honored. Sarah broke the silence. "Grandpa, what are you going to do now that you've graduated?" Harold smiled, an expression that reached his eyes in a way it hadn't in years. "Well, honey, I was thinking about maybe going to graduate school. After all, I've got some catching up to do." They both laughed, and it was the kind of laughter that comes after tears, after recognition, after a lifetime of waiting for the right moment. The impact of that day rippled outward in ways Harold never could have anticipated. The story of the mocked graduate who turned out to be a war hero spread quickly through the university and then beyond. Local news picked it up, then national outlets. But more importantly, it changed the people who were there. The students who had laughed learned something about respect and assumption. The faculty learned something about the diverse paths that lead to education. The community learned something about the veterans living quietly among them, carrying stories of sacrifice and service that most people never think to ask about. Harold started volunteering at the university's Veteran Services Office, helping other older veterans navigate the process of returning to education. He discovered he wasn't alone in his late-in-life academic pursuits. There were others who had put dreams on hold for service, for family, for the demands of survival, and who were now reclaiming those dreams in their golden years. He became an advocate for non-traditional students, speaking about the value of life experience and the courage it takes to start over at any age. The Bronze Star ceremony also opened doors Harold hadn't expected. Invitations came to speak at other graduations, at veteran events, at schools where young students needed to understand the connection between their freedom and the sacrifices of others. Each time he spoke, Harold emphasized the same message: that everyone has a story worth respecting, that courage comes in many forms, and that it's never too late to pursue your dreams if you're willing to work for them. But perhaps the most significant change was in Harold himself. For 70 years, he'd carried the weight of his service alone, never speaking about the friends he'd lost, the fear he'd faced, or the pride he'd felt in serving his country. The ceremony had given him permission to acknowledge that part of his life, to honor it alongside his academic achievement. He began attending veteran support groups, not as someone seeking help, but as someone offering the wisdom that comes from integrating all parts of your life into a coherent whole. The diploma and the medal sat side by side in a frame on Harold's kitchen table, where he continued to read and study even after graduation. Sarah visited more often now, bringing her own children to hear their great-grandfather's stories. The stories weren't just about war anymore, but about resilience, about the different kinds of courage required for different seasons of life, about the importance of never giving up on the things that matter to you. Harold's story became a reminder that the person sitting next to you on the bus, standing in line at the grocery store, or walking slowly across a graduation stage might be carrying a lifetime of experiences that would humble and inspire you if you took the time to learn about them. It became a call to look beyond surface appearances and to offer respect as a default rather than something that has to be earned through youth or conventional success. The mocking laughter that had started that graduation ceremony was replaced by something much more valuable: understanding. Understanding that heroism often goes unrecognized. Understanding that learning never stops for those who remain curious and determined. Understanding that the elderly deserve respect not just for their age, but for the accumulated wisdom, sacrifice, and perseverance that age represents. As Harold often said in his later speeches, "I didn't go back to school to prove anything to anyone else. I went back to prove something to myself. But what I learned was that when you finally honor all parts of your life, when you stop hiding pieces of your story, you give others permission to do the same. And that's when real learning begins." The Bronze Star and the bachelor's degree represented more than individual achievement. They represented the integration of service and learning, of sacrifice and personal growth, of past and present. They represented the idea that it's never too late to claim your dreams, never too late to be recognized for your contributions, and never too late to inspire others to look beyond their assumptions and see the heroes hiding in plain sight. Harold Peterson walked across that graduation stage as an elderly student seeking a degree. He walked off that stage as a recognized war hero and an inspiration to everyone who witnessed his story. But more than that, he walked off that stage as a whole person, finally able to honor both the young soldier he'd been and the lifelong learner he'd always remained. The laughter had stopped, but the learning never would. Take a moment to think about the elderly people in your own life. What stories might they be carrying? What dreams might they still be pursuing? What respect might they deserve that you haven't thought to offer? Leave a comment sharing a story about an older person who has inspired you, because sometimes the greatest teachers are the ones who have lived the longest and learned the most.